It was hard deciding which of these two beautiful texts to preach from today. The text in Mark was very rich, but this thing in James, this speaks to something that Bower Hill Church is trying to do right now with our becoming a Matthew 25 congregation. And James, as we saw last week if you were here, James of Jerusalem does not mince words. He's a straightforward kind of guy. We don't mean to favor the rich. We don't intend to show preferential treatment to the people who need it the least. But there's maybe something deep in our evolutionary makeup that causes us to be more welcoming and more open to people who look successful. Maybe we feel less threatened by them. Maybe we think they won't rob us, though James kind of does imply that they're exactly the ones who will rob us. Jesus rightly said that the poor we have with us always, but why? Why do we have the poor with us always? Why is there poverty? Why do we take it for granted and act as if it's natural and eternal like the mountains? Our human worth is not measured by what we acquire and possess. In the divine economy, our goodness and our faith is measured by how we treat those who can do nothing for us. This goes for us as individuals, as a church, and as a society. Our treatment of the vulnerable is who we really are. How are we doing? As a society, as a church, as individuals. What does the world see when they look to the way we act? I don't know if some of you are old enough, well, I do know that some of you are indeed old enough, to remember the stories we used to hear from our parents and grandparents about living through the Great Depression. My grandparents were children during the Great Depression, and they loved to tell their Depression tales with just a note of pride, but always tinged with sorrow. The fear and the uncertainty of being really, really poor, that stays with you for your whole life. It leaves scars that don't go away. My grandparents would tell their stories as if to say, "That's how tough we were, kiddo. You think you got problems? I used to have to put newspaper in my shoes, and there were newspapers that I stole out of the trash can." My grandparents loved to tell their Depression stories, and they were tough. They were tough people. They would often sprinkle those Depression stories in with their angry rants about what they called back in the 70s and 80s the welfare state, along with phrases like, "If you don't work, you don't eat." And my grandfather loved to say, there's no shame in being poor, but there's shame in being lazy. My grandparents used to speak of pouring coffee over stale crusts of bread and calling it coffee soup. And sometimes it was coffee with recycled grounds that they had used 2 or 3 times. My grandmother used to say that they were so poor during the Depression that they lived in a cellar, she and her 4 siblings and parents, in one room with only one window, but they felt good about it because there was another family that lived in the cellar below the cellar, the old wine cellar that had no window. And then she used to tell us that her dad was a butcher who would bring home all the pieces of the chicken that nobody wanted. And if they were lucky, those were the livers and the gizzards, but if they were unlucky, they were the feet. When other grandmothers were giving their kids chicken fingers, my grandmother only did fish sticks. She could not abide the smell of chicken cooking. Even in restaurants, if somebody nearby ordered chicken, she would feel sick. You know, my grandfather said that there's no shame in being poor. Maybe he believed that. I don't. I can't believe that. I mean, I didn't live through the Depression, but I did get free lunches at school, and I was ashamed of that. I used to say to the lunch lady, "Here, pretend I'm giving you money." And she would say, "Oh, honey." But she would pretend I was giving her money. And I don't know if this is true of some of you, but I never had an article of clothing that did not belong to my older brother first. But then I had to steward it for the two brothers after me. And by the time it got to that fifth child, wow. Sometimes people would notice me wearing my older brother's clothes. And it's embarrassing. One more little vignette. A few years ago, I was learning to drive a stick, as I have told you with great pride many times. And I was trying to parallel park, jerking that old stick shift around in Bloomfield, where the streets are about as wide as that aisle. And I bumped into an old jalopy, and it was already banged up. It was 20 years old. But the guy that owned it was really mad. And he yelled at me, "You think because I drive an old car, you can bump into it like that? You can just bang it around?" And I did feel bad, but I mostly felt bad for the self-consciousness of his statement. I mean, I was only driving a Kia Soul. But he thought that I judged him for his car? I don't think we do that anymore, do we? Judge people by the cars they drive? He thought I judged him for driving a 20-year-old car. I have driven 20-year-old cars. His demeanor changed completely when I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And we got out and we searched his car for a dent that I had not given it, for it had several that had come from other sources. I offered him a genuine apology and his mood changed dramatically. But I went away from that encounter saddened, because I saw the shame and the anger that he lives with all the time. And it's not about the car. It's about where he is in life. It's the frustration. Those who live in the grip of poverty do feel its crushing shame. A society as rich as ours ought to be ashamed of it too. The Epistle of James is great. We read it last week. We're going to be reading it again next week. It contradicts every other book in the New Testament, and it echoes Jesus perfectly. John and Paul in the epistles and in the Gospel of John and the epistles of John, they're always telling you, just believe, have faith. Faith is the only way. But James doesn't like that. James actually insists that it's our actions that make us who we are. It's our actions, done from the heart, that help to redeem us and make us whole. And I would invite you, if you find belief difficult sometimes, just go out and do stuff. Just go out and live like a Christian. And that's probably going to be enough. James even asks in disbelief, "Can faith save you?" And Paul would be like, "Yeah, it's the only thing that can save you." But James is not happy with that. James is not so sure. And he names our natural human tendency to favor those who are already doing well in the world and to neglect those who are already doing poorly. And James concludes the matter by saying, faith in itself is not enough. You've got to get out there and do something. How you treat the one who is poor, in the words of this epistle, is the truest measure of your faith. It's true of society, it's true of our churches, it's true of us as individuals. How we treat those who can do nothing for us, that's who we really are. That's our character. But poverty, it's such a political issue. Should churches be talking about it? I mean, sure, everybody wants the churches to take care of poor people. But should we be asking the dangerous questions like, why are they poor? What made them poor? Does society have to be this way? Is this just the inevitable way of things? Or is poverty created like everything else in our society? Society is not sacred. It's not handed down from God. It's developed by people. Let me ask you this. Have you ever been sitting in traffic, rushing to catch a train, or a plane, maybe a train, hurrying to meet some deadline, when you asked yourself in all your stress, wait, Look at all these people running around. What are we doing? How did this get to be our lives? And we're all acting like it's all so urgent, the running and the hurrying and the catching planes. Flying, how normal is that? We're all participating in this craziness as if it were so urgent and normal, but why? How did things get this way? Once there were like stegosauruses, and now there are annual car inspections. People on the other side of the world have their weapons trained upon me at all times. And we have our weapons pointed at them, but we don't know them and we don't hate them. Is this the way life is supposed to be? Is this what society is supposed to be? Society is made by humans. It's not sacred. Am I not created for something better? For joy? For love? For community? For service? For meaningful work? Aren't these the things for which I'm created? Are we not all of us just driving our cars and catching our planes in an endless quest to be happy? Maybe the way things are is not the way they have to be. Maybe the way things are is not the way they're supposed to be. Maybe poverty itself is just another evil human concoction, like the divine right of kings and nobility and slavery and serfdom. Maybe it serves the same ends. You know, I saw this most clearly when I lived in Cameroon in West Africa with all its millions in extreme poverty. I felt the sadness of knowing that maybe at the very most I could lift one of them out, just one. I felt the sadness of knowing that I could only rescue one. I could help others from time to time, but I couldn't do anything substantial for them. I was living on $300 a month. And the one I lifted out proved to be brilliant. Some of you have met him. And creative and productive. But if he had remained in his poverty, the world would have been robbed of all his gifts and all the service he has given. And that's what poverty is. It robs us of potential. What does the poem say that we all learned in high school? Full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. That's the way it is when people live and die in poverty. Poverty is a political issue, yeah, but it's also a profoundly spiritual one. It's a matter of ethical concern when neighbors go hungry, uninsured, unable to afford medications, with the constant threat of getting evicted, eating processed foods from Family Dollar, dying before their time. It's a spiritual issue that 12% of the population is barely holding on and enduring all the anger and the shame that such a life entails. True, some receive charity and they treat it as their due and they're not grateful, I know that. But most are not that way. Most of those who are reduced to asking for help do not feel good about it. You see it in their eyes. It's dehumanizing. You see fear, you see shame, you see sorrow, sometimes you see anger. Why talk about all this on Kickoff Sunday? I know you're asking yourselves that, because Bower Hill last year decided that we are a Matthew 25 congregation. Matthew 25 is Jesus's one of his longest parables about the sheep and the goats. Actually, it's got several parables in the chapter. But the long one is about the sheep and the goats, where the king at the end of history separates those who were good to the vulnerable from those who were not good to the vulnerable. And that's it. The ones who were good to the vulnerable are called blessed. And so we have committed to be a Matthew 25 congregation, and our issue is systemic poverty. We are trying to tackle the issue of poverty and do what we can about it. Now, what can one church do? What can a church of this size do? We're going to see. We've already raised how many millions of dollars for, or how many, close to $1 million? How much did we raise for? 49,000. How much medical debt did we alleviate? 5.9 million. This is what we're trying to do. And it is an issue of the Spirit and of faith. It's not just a political issue. Bower Hill is a Matthew 25 congregation. We've always been a socially engaged congregation. And at this point in human history, we feel like this is where we are being called to become, get this, poverty abolitionists. Do you like that? At one time, churches, especially around here, became slavery abolitionists. Presbyterians and Congregationalists led the charge on that. And today, we are called to be poverty abolitionists. Google that term when you get home, or whatever search engine you use. Look it up on the internet, and you'll find all kinds of insights into how to combat poverty in your daily life. Poverty abolitionism. And also, we'll be discussing this book in January. This is Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond. He mostly writes about poverty. You could probably get this book used online for as much as it'll cost them to mail you. It's excellent, it's up to date, it's entertaining, and we'll be discussing this in January. I hope that you'll consider reading it. But mostly, let's think differently about poverty because we don't think about it. The politicians are always talking about the middle classes, and that's important, but nobody's talking about the poor, really. Let's think differently about poverty because we don't always see it. Let's think better. Its existence diminishes all of us spiritually. It diminishes our well-being, for it causes us to not really see other people. It causes us to not really see their full humanity. And it's not always due to laziness. As much as I loved my grandfather, I think he was wrong about that. It's not always due to laziness. Just like the rest of society, maybe it's created. Maybe it's completely unnecessary. And how we treat the vulnerable, not just the poor, ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, gender minorities, women, children, anybody who is vulnerable, how we treat them, that is who we really are. And in the spirit of James, let us take action, for it is our acts that will finally save us. Amen.